Attention, ladies and gents, and welcome to our lesson today. And today we'll focus on the continuation of our topic that we are continuing with from the previous lesson, that is colonial administration. And today we will focus on direct rule and assimilation policy. Remember, in the previous lesson we were talking about direct rule, where indirect rule, where our major focus was in Nigeria, southern Nigeria and northern Nigeria. Now for northern Nigeria, they were administered by the British under what is called indirect rule. Now today we'll go to direct rule, and particularly in Zimbabwe. Then afterwards, because the subtopic is a bit short, we'll go and accomplish assimilation policy that the French used in Senegal or West Africa. I will welcome you to our lesson, and I want us to encourage us that we should follow a series or a string of these lessons, because we are progressing steadily with Form 3 work. Now, colonial administration, direct rule and assimilation policy, both for northern Nigeria, southern Nigeria, then direct rule in Zimbabwe, and assimilation policy in Senegal, all of them fall under paper 2, because all of them are part of history that touches nations outside Kenya. Now let us continue today in our lesson today. So I'll start with direct rule in southern Rhodesia, or what is known as Zimbabwe. Now up to until 1899, Zimbabwe or southern Rhodesia used to be part of the 3 territories of of the central colonies of Britain. So they formed the spheres of the British Central African colonies. But again, it was administered, the company rule was also administered in this part. And the company rule that was entitled to administer rule in southern Rhodesia, which is Zimbabwe, was British South African Company. Now, part of the territories of the Central African part that was belonging to the British include Nyasaland, which is currently Malawi, northern Rhodesia, which is the current day Zambia, and southern Rhodesia, which is the current day Zimbabwe, and it is the country that I want us to focus on in a few minutes. Now, to understand, I've made you start to know the owner of the British South African Company that was chartered the rule of southern Rhodesia. Now the head of this company, or the owner of this company, was somebody who was called Cecil Rhodes. Why did the British use direct rule in southern Zimbabwe? Maybe you'll ask yourself as a student, or as a person who is interested in history, or a historian, why couldn't it apply indirect rule the way the British used to administer parts of Kenya or parts of the established northern Nigeria? Now I'll give you the reasons in a few. Now Cecil Rhodes was an ambitious man. He wanted the British to have a sphere of influence, not only in southern Rhodesia, but from south, that is down in Cape Town, up to Cairo. That is almost from southern Africa going upwards up until the northern African territories. So he used his financial resources, because he was ambitious, to marshal the settlement of 200 Europeans in a place which was called Mashonaland, which I've said that was Malawi in 1890. And in the following consequent years, more settlers arrived in southern Rhodesia. Why were settlers arriving, and where were they coming from? So partly, most of them were from Britain, but majority of them came from Southern Africa. Why did they come from South Africa? At that time, the Britons had arrived in the Cape of Good Hope, or Cape Town, and they were interested with the climate of the Cape Province that replicated the climate that was there in Britain. So when they found the already whites who are there, who are the Boers, they marshaled them, or they drove them to the drier parts of Southern Africa, or to the Namib Desert, or Kalahari Desert as we know it. And if you're a lover of history, you'll know what is called the Great Trek of Southern Africa, when the Boers walked with their cattle and belongings out from South Africa as they were proceeding northwards. But that was not the major, what I wanted to focus on today. So today I want to focus on Southern Rhodesia. Now, at that time, the whites found that Zimbabwe, it was a place that they could replicate whatever was happening in South Africa, where South Africa was just a settler economy, and they wanted to make Southern Rhodesia also a settler economy, where whites could just go there and have their leaseholds and stay there and do their activities like mining and farming. That was that. So today we want to know that why Cecil Rhodes encouraged the settlers to come to Zimbabwe, and then why the British, who are the major colonial power, used in direct rule in Zimbabwe. If you look at your slides, I've outlined them. So number one, the British desired a direct control of the mineral wealth so as to maximize profit. When the British came to Southern Rhodesia, they wanted to exploit the mineral resources, and they also wanted to exploit the agricultural lands. I'm going to explain how they acquired the lands, and it's not far from what we had in Kenya. Again, the British also, there existed a large number of European settlers and British South African company personnel who could take part up leadership positions. Now, when the British had colonized Southern Rhodesia, then they gave, I told you that in 1899, they gave Cecil Rhodes and his Bisako company the authority to have the autonomy to administer Southern Rhodesia as part of the British sphere of influence. So he used to administer that colony on behalf of the British. Now Bisako, because Cecil Rhodes had a lot of finance and he had a lot of influence, he encouraged the settlers to settle in Southern Rhodesia. And not only that, he also financed them. So he also financed the personnel or the administrators who could take up leadership position. Again, Zimbabwe or Southern Rhodesia at that time lacked a well-established traditional system of governance, prompting the British to assume direct control. Remember Northern Nigeria. Why did the British use indirect rule in Northern Nigeria? Is because Northern Nigeria, in the previous lesson that I taught, Northern Nigeria had existing established traditional systems like a leadership system that was led by the Caliphate and delegated to the emirs of the different emirates of Northern Nigeria. Now in Southern Rhodesia, unfortunately, this was lacking. This established system, traditional system of leadership was lacking, meaning the British found a vacuum of leadership in that country. Then the past resistance by Zimbabweans, for instance, during the Chimurenga War, this prompted the British to have a mistrust in Africa. Now, before the Chimurenga War, the British had entitled some of the African chiefs from the Shona and the Bele communities, both that occupy Southern Rhodesia or Zimbabwe, with leadership. But when they saw they had a mistrust with the colonialists, or when they had their grievances, all of these African communities, they were united, and it is their chiefs who did this work of uniting them. And this meant that the British were no longer going to trust these chiefs again. Now they wanted to administer Zimbabwe directly. Then again, the Bisako or the British South African Company financed the administrative costs. So the British, they were not going to lose, they were not going to have a lot of personnel on their payroll, just the way they, in the Nigerian part where, you remember in Nigeria, the British lack adequate personnel and the financial muscle to pay everybody from the chief up to the colonial secretary. Now in Britain, because Bisako was a very, very rich company, it meant that they had money. So with this money, they could just, the Bisako, they could finance this administrative cost of leadership. Now afterwards, I want us now to go to the application of direct rule in Zimbabwe before I go to the structure of this rule in Zimbabwe. And this I'll have to explain to you because it is something that has insight, deep history that is very, very important for you to learn. Now, from the year 1899, when the British started had entitled the British South African Company the autonomy to administer their rule, colonial rule in Zimbabwe, up to until 1923. The Bisako Company did their job perfectly. Now in 1923, the rule of the Bisako ended, and we'll see why. Why? Because the company, number one, it had done its part by encouraging very many white settlers that arrived from both Britain and South Africa and even Australia and New Zealand to arrive and settle in Zimbabwe. Now, when the settlers arrived, they found gold mines and also they found farms. So, Bisako, for them to get the labor, they forced the Africans to provide labor on the farms of the whites and also on the gold mines of the mines. To enable them do this, they had initially, through the Matembele Order in Council of July 1894, this company had been empowered, or the Bisako Company had been empowered to impose hard tax on the Africans. Now again, they never stopped there. They established a legislative council in that country that was predominantly dominated by the white minorities. Now 5 elected settlers were there to represent the white minority grievances. Then the Africans were not represented, and they never even had voting rights in this country. Now again, they established an order of council in 1898. Here, the British government, they established an executive council and appointed a resident commissioner and commandant general for Rhodesia that served to establish the British imperial presence. Now, slowly by slowly, you are seeing that the British, imperial British, they're starting to impose themselves on Zimbabweans, and are now slowly but steadily, or slowly but surely, removing or sidelining the British South African Company. Up to 1902, the Native Department had been created, yes? And here, a European Native Commissioner was deployed. Now, the work of this European Native Commissioner was to collect taxes and recruit labor. Collect taxes from who? Collect taxes from the Africans through a hard tax, and collect taxes from the settlers. Then again, they were also to control the labor production for the white settlers. Now, the white rule was strengthening itself in South Rhodesia, and at this time, there was a control of land between the settler and British South African Company. So settlers wanted to control most of the land, and the settlers also wanted to control most of the land. Now, in an attempt to satisfy these settlers, the company gave in, and it did this so by giving these white settlers more position in the Southern Rhodesian government. Now, these settlers, they took advantage of this, especially their political influence, to ensure that they attained a considerable degree of self-governance. So, just way back from around 1929, the settlers in Zimbabwe, or the then Southern Rhodesia, that gathered considerable influence that they even wanted to have self-dominion, or they wanted to be independent. But it was a nation that was to be independent, with the whites being at the top notch of leadership. Now, in 1923, by the time the company rule was terminated by the British, Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, was declared a crown land, or a crown colony, meaning it was just like other crown lands, like British East Africa, Uganda, Southern Nigeria, Egypt, Sudan by then, and Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland. Now, a new constitution was established afterwards, and it's established a legislative council and a cabinet of ministers. Now, the governor was appointed to represent the British Crown. He was appointed. However, the governor did not have a lot of powers in this settler-dominated legislative and executive council. Thereby, after 1923, the settlers, they strived to create their white-dominated country that followed the South African model. In the next chapters, when I'm going to teach about the rise of African nationalism, you'll find that what was the bond of contention in South Africa? It was the white minority rule. That was the apartheid rule. Now, this model is what the whites or the white settlers wanted to follow exactly in Zimbabwe. Now, under this policy, the white minority used to form the top cream of the leadership, while the African majority used to form the base. Now, in 1930, there was the passing of Land Appointment Act. And this meant that the productive land of the Africans was taken and given back to the settlers. Now, this was a regressive approach because it deprived Africans of their land. It alienated them to the unproductive reserves. It congested them into reserve areas. And we'll see how this led to the struggle and nationalism of Southern Rhodesia. Now, years later, from 1923 to 1980, it was characterized by a struggle of the African majority for self-rule or for the rule against the white minority who are oppressing them. Now, in an effort to cling to this power or this colony, Southern Rhodesia, the then Southern Rhodesia, who is somebody called Ian Smith, he declared a unilateral declaration of independence or UDI. What was the declaration of this UDI? It meant that Zimbabwe became independent of Britain. Now, Britain, because it was not going to lose its colony, or it was not going to lose one of its place for getting raw materials and other things, they approached the United Nations to declare sanctions on Zimbabwe. Consequently, it led the Zimbabweans or the Southern Rhodesia to adopt a new constitution to further narrow the rights of the Africans. Now, by 1970, Ian's government had declared Southern Rhodesia to be a republic, and then meaning it had broken ties with the British completely. Now, at the time of Ian, in the 1970s, Southern Rhodesia was independent, but it was not called Zimbabwe. I will tell you why. And then, it was a country where the prime minister was a white man called Ian Smith. Again, it was a place where the white minority used to rule the African majority. This is the essence of this direct rule. Now, this declaration angered Africans who rose through armed struggle until when ZANU, the Africans, form an armed struggle that was led by ZANU-PF, that is Zimbabwe African National Union, under Robert Mugabe, and Zimbabwe's African People's Union, ZAPU, under Joshua Nkomo. It is these two who led to the independence of Zimbabwe in 1980, when Uncle Bob, or properly known as Robert Mugabe, became the first prime minister of Southern Rhodesia. Then he later named the country Zimbabwe. I want us to check the structure of direct rule in Zimbabwe, and I'll explain it to you. Now, in your slide, there is a prime minister at the top, then the governor, and the legislative council. Now, if I want to explain each and every one of them, the prime minister, I've said, by then was Ian Smith. Now, he had somebody who was a colonial governor who was just appointed to supervise the British Crown land. But again, this governor, he had very, very minimal powers. Why? There was a legislative council, and in this legislative council, majority of them were the white settlers, meaning they used to legislate laws that really oppressed the governor. So the governor was almost not there. Then under the legislative council was the Native Affairs Department. It used to deal with the native is somebody who is indigenous. So the indigenous or the African affairs. Whoever was in charge was a white man. The prime minister was a white man, Ian Smith. The governor was a white man. The legislative council were the white people or the settlers who are the majority. Then again, the chiefs in charge of the districts were still white men. Then the locations under the sub-chiefs. Now here, the sub-chiefs were the people who are now, I can say they were the Africans, but they were still minority. Now with this, it meant that these people of Zimbabwe, or by then Southern Rhodesia, they were very, very oppressed. Now I want to explain to you. The governor was appointed by the British government just to represent the monarch. So just to represent the king or the queen of Britain that at least this was an area of influence. That was the only work of the governor. Then the Legislative Council, which majority were of the settlers, they were the people who used to dominate this assembly or the parliament, and it was the most powerful arm of the government. Why? It is here that the white minority used to formulate their oppressive rule against the black majority. Then the prime minister, who controlled this, both the legislative and the executive, he was the most powerful person. Yeah, he formed the executive branch of this government. All these parts that I've mentioned were all made of the whites only. Then the Native Affairs Department, which was equivalent of a district in Kenya or a district in Nigeria, both southern and northern Nigeria, was also under a white officer, as I've said. Then the districts were divided into location, and each location was divided into sub-location. Now, under here, there were sub-chiefs, and I've told you, sub-chiefs who were below were the Africans. Now, these are the duties of the sub-chiefs. Just number 1, to collect tax. Number 2, to allocate land to Africans. Number 3, to recruit African labor forcefully, yeah, for the European firms. Then again, they were to solve cases involving Africans. Now, these are the, quickly, let us go to the impacts or the effects of direct rule in Zimbabwe. Both of them were, some of them are positive, some of them are negative. And in the next 2 slides, I'll explain each and every one of them. It led to land alienation of Africans from their native land. So the Africans, they were derived of their land, and they were alienated to the infertile and overpopulated reserves, while the majority of land was left for the African. One thing that Robert Mugabe had to deal with was it is like what Malema is trying to advocate for right now in South Africa, where land is being repatriated from the hands of the white minority who never bought it, but they took it by force back to the Africans. So at this time, the white people, they alienated the Africans of their land. Then number 2, Africans were subject to poverty and suffering. Of course, when their land was taken, it meant that they could not overstock the way they used to do. They could not even practice agriculture. If they were to do agriculture within the reserves, it was just the one for subsistent farming, one that could sustain their households, and not the one that could enable their pockets to have cash. So meaning they had to be oppressed this way for them to provide labor in the white farms. And this made the Africans to be very, very poor, while the white minority or the settler minority were very, very rich. I'll go to the 3rd one. African tradition. Europeans took much of the productive lands, while Africans were placed in reserved. I've explained that. Then African traditional chiefs, they lost their authorities. Yes, already the Shona and the Bele, they had existing chiefs. Before the Chimurenga War, you'll realize that they had a structured way of administration. If you remember the chiefs, they were the ones who even mobilized them to go take up arms and fight the Chimurenga War. Now these African chiefs, they lost the authority to the puppets of the minority. That is the chiefs, African chiefs who are appointed, and the sub-chiefs. Again, the Africans who were appointed by the British chiefs, they acted as puppets. So they were like, British was the bogeyman or the bully, and all these people had to do was to dance to the tune. Somebody says that he who pays the piper calls for the tune. So it is the British who could tell them what to do, how to subjugate or disenfranchise the Africans by making them to collect tax, a lot of things. Then again, the administration of the colony was in the hands of the British. That is self-explained. All throughout this lesson, I've been explaining that. Then the British delegated the administration of the colony to Bisako and later white minority. Now, I had told you that initially, Cecil Rhodes and its Bisako company were given the mandate to administer Southern Rhodesia or Zimbabwe on behalf of the British. When the British had seen everything was good, or everything had been put in place by and was smoothly running by Cecil Rhodes, they assumed this colony and they placed it a crown colony. It is this that led this white minority to rule this country. Then the African traditional economy was undermined as they were expected to work on the white mines. and farms. Now, the African economy was one that was based on rearing cattle and again crop cultivation. Now, since they were pushed in the reserves, these places were so minute, or again they were reduced because they had to raise money for paying taxes. Their economy was undermined totally. So they had to focus on the cash crop, helping the white men to get cash crop for them to pay taxes. Then again, the introduction of Christianity and Western education undermined African culture. It goes without saying that they left their gods, they left their ways of religion, they left their ways, and most of them embraced Christianity. In Kenyatta's book, he says that when the British came, they told us to close our eyes. As soon as we opened our eyes, after saying amen, our land was gone. This was the same case that the British did in Zimbabwe. Then let us look at additional impacts of direct rule in Zimbabwe. Number one, Africans again were forced to, they were subjected to forced labor, and they were forced to work in the European mines and farms. Then African movement was confined to the reserves, and additionally they were required to carry identity cards. I want to explain this. Now, in the white reserves, in the African reserve, that is the place that was reserved for the Africans. So it is here that they could move independently. If they were to move in other parts of what was formerly what they used to occupy in parts of their country, or the farms that belonged to the white minority, they used to have a tag. This tag was in form of the identity cards that used to identify with them from wherever they come from, their colonial masters, and even their ethnic communities. I told you, right now, most developed countries do not operate with identity cards. It is underdeveloped countries that still operate with identity cards, whereby even some of your details like ethnicity are also listed in some of these identity cards. It is a problem of developing nations. And where did we get this? We inherited this from our colonial. It is a colonial mentality. So we inherited them from our colonial powers. So this was also true with Zimbabwe. Then it led to the development, it led to the segregation, racial segregation that undermined and disadvantaged the Africans. Now, Africans were disenfranchised in all spheres. Number one, leadership, they were not part and parcel. Number two, administration, they were not part and parcel. And even the economy. They were part and parcel of the economy, but at the bottom of the ladder or the bottom of the chain. They were like the producers, like their labor is what was wanted, but not their economical input as per se. Now again, it led to the rise of African nationalism. No, it led to the development of transport and infrastructure in settler-occupied areas. Up to 1980s, when Zimbabwe got its independence, it was the country that had the most advanced rail system in Africa. In fact, it had an electric rail and electric trains by 1980s. So it shows you how the white settlers, they developed the areas where they used to settle. But the same was not true for the areas that were reserved for Africans. So to date, those were some of the aspects that they left. Then the last one is that it led to the rise of African nationalism, which turned violence due to lack of constitutional means to articulate their problem. When these people were formulating laws, as earlier mentioned, they forgot African. The Legislative Council had no African at all. Actually, it had the minority of the settlers having a lot of representatives, the way Africans never had. As a consequently, the Africans decided to use violent means for them to fight for to struggle and fight for their independence. Now, this was a consequence of direct rule. Now, let me go to let me say one thing. Today, Africa is one of the continents where most people are aligned to their tribal cocoons whenever they elect leadership. Some of these things, you cannot blame them entirely, the Africans entirely for this. But most of this is because of this direct rule that the British left, and indirect rule that encouraged people to identify with ethnicity, how they used to employ African chiefs, also dealt with ethnicity. That is why in most countries where Britain, which are formerly British colonies, because of this, their policies of both direct rule and indirect rule, they've left these countries with ethnic strife. So if you go to South Africa, there are ethnic strifes and even racial strifes. If you go to a place like Kenya, you all know our story. If you go to Zimbabwe, there's ethnic strife. If you go to Nigeria, it is even predominant. There is a bit regional strife, ethnic strife, religion strife. It is because of the impact of this direct and indirect rule. There is a power that colonized Africa called the French. But when the French came to Africa, they came with something called assimilation. So for the next minutes, I want you to forget about Zimbabwe. I want you to forget about Nigeria. And since we are now going to focus on assimilation. Now I'll explain assimilation, but let me first note it down. So from direct rule to Zimbabwe, we are going to assimilation in policy. The focus will be on Senegal. In comparison of assimilation policy and British system of administration, that is both direct and indirect rule, you'll find that one thing, the assimilation policy left the French colonies with almost nothing. They don't have this problem of ethnicity. So let me do assimilation policy. What is assimilation? It comes from the Latin word or French word assimil, which means to cause or to resemble. That is, they wanted to cause Africans to resemble them, to speak French, go to Catholic like French, cook like French, walk like French. By the way, French cuisine is a very, very nice cuisine, and it is men who dominate the kitchen. So maybe if you go to such French, former Francophone, or the Francophone Africa or former French colonies, you'll find that mostly they've adopted French culture. That is why the very, very art and culture in most countries like DRC, countries like Ivory Coast, they really replicate the culture in Paris. Why? Paris is known as the cultural center of Europe. It is the place where art and everything is gathered. But that is not for this lesson. I want to teach you assimilation in West Africa. Let me go introduce you to this. Today, there is the tournament of football that FIFA is under FIFA. That is the Euro tournament. If you look at the French national team, it is more of an Africa united team. Why? Because most Africans, through assimilation, they managed to become French citizens. And because they've migrated into France, it means that they've been treated with equal measures. They've been treated with equality with the French. It's just like assimil or to cause. So they've made them to become Frenchmen. So you'll wonder how a French team is more white, is more black, while Morocco or Algeria, a team from Northern Africa, is more white. Yeah, it's because of this assimilation policy. Now, assimilation form of government was adopted by the French to enable them to really rule the Africans with dignity. The overriding factor was the French assumed that their civilization was superior to that of the Africans. So they wanted the Africans to discard their traditions, to discard their culture, to discard their ways of worship and ways of operation to resemble French. Now, once they attained this civilization, because the French believed they were civilized than the Africa, then it meant that they had to attain this civilization to the highest possible standard. This policy was aimed, as I have said, to change every aspect of African life, of the people, and also to mold the colonies or the society to replicate the image of France, Today, even the currency of most former French colonies, they are called franc. So you will go Senegalese franc, Ivorian, Cote d'Ivoire franc, you go to Rwandese franc, Burundian franc, all of these countries that were Madagascar's franc, and all of them, because they were assimilated, and their society was one that replicated the image of France. Now let us go to Senegal, and I'll tell you why French was very, very important. Senegal was very, very pivotal for France. Now, when the French applied this policy in West Africa, it considered these territories or countries part of their provinces. Now, each of these provinces, they had members who are represented in the French National Assembly, and French laws used to apply in all its colonies or its overseas provinces, just the way they did back in France. Now, this was assimilation policy. I can say, or history explains that, it was adapted from the revolution of the year 1789, after Napoleon Bonaparte and everyone had liberated France from the rule of King Louis, where they wanted to guarantee the equality of every man. Now, after this revolution, French Revolution, there was a guarantee of liberty of all men, regardless of their color, regardless of their ideas, and French rights to all citizens used to apply to every French citizen, regardless of where they were. So even in the French provinces or the French colonies of West Africa, their policies and rights were to be applied with equal measures. It is this that prompted the French to adopt assimilation policy in the communities of West Africa, or Senegal in particular. In 1884, all the French communities in all the French colonies, they were emancipated from slavery. So they never allowed slavery to take place in any part of their territory. Now, most of their territory includes the West African territory, which we know were predominant with slave trade. So places like Senegal, places like Mauritania, places like Morocco, places like Algeria, places like Tunisia. In all these places, they emancipated slavery. Again, they wanted everybody to have a representation of French in the French National Assembly. Now, it is this with this mind that assimilation was adopted in French West Africa, and specifically in Senegal. Now, in Senegal, this French rule was applied in 4 major urban centers, or 4 major towns that are there in your slide. So the first one is Saint Louis, that is the right pronunciation in French, Gori, Dakar, and Rufisque. Now, these are the 4 areas. Now, why did the French use this assimilation in Senegal? Number one, the Senegalese had a long history with the contacts with the French before colonization. Because of the transatlantic trade that you are taught in Form 2, already part of the French traders from Europe had already interacted with the Senegalese. Now again, the French felt that their culture was superior to the African that had explained earlier. Then the people of West African coast were increasingly becoming urbanized. So because of the transatlantic trade, the people of West African, they wanted to stay in the urban centers, particularly those that were next to the Atlantic Ocean or those who were at the coast. Then there was an the Africans in West Africa wanted to enjoy the privileges of assimilation. Yes, because if you are assimilated, you are treated as a French citizen, meaning you could receive Western medicine, Western education, and you could even go to Paris and stay there. So this made them to be assimilated. Then there was existing population of mulattoes at the coast of West Africa who were of mixed origin. Who is a mulatto? If you go to Brazil, it is predominantly mulattoes predominantly stay there. Why? Because of the mixed culture, mixed racial intermarriage. They are the products of mixed interracial marriage. So the children of both whites and blacks, somebody like Leroy Sané of Bayern Munich, he is a mulatto. So these mulattoes were already existing in the coast of West Africa, even before the French arrived there. So these mulattoes, they really associated themselves with and considered themselves French. Then the many community members were familiar with European traders and missionaries. Now let us look at the structure of assimilation as applied in Senegal. Now at the top was the lieutenant governor who was in charge of the country or the French province of of Senegal. Then number 2, Commandant de Cercle, or the commander in charge of province. This one was also white. Then Chief de Subdivision, or the chief in charge of the district. Then Chief de Canton, who was the chief in charge of the location. And Chief de Village, which is the chief in charge of the village. Forgive my French. I am from an Anglophone country, but I'm really trying French. So condition for assimilation. What were some of these conditions for you to become assimilated into the French culture? Number 1, if you are able to speak French. Some people like me, maybe we could be part of that. Then to be able to read and write in French. I told you I really fit this. Then reside in KUTV commune in Senegal. So the people who resided in these communities, KUTV communities in Senegal, in the various towns that I told you, they were part of this. They were assimilated. If you had served in the French public service or army as proof of loyalty to the French government, then this automatically made you a French citizen or made you assimilated. Then practice monogamy. I think this is where most Africans, myself, I could be included because I believe in monogamy, but others could not. Then convert to Christianity. That is also a plus. That was a plus. But this one backfired majorly in Senegal, and I'll tell you why. Because Senegal was predominantly Muslim culture, so they were not willing to give up their Muslim culture. Now, what are the benefits that were enjoyed by the assimilated Africans? These are the benefits that they enjoyed. Number 1, they were allowed to send their representatives to the French chambers of the deputies, meaning they were direct French citizens. Number 2, they could vote. They had a right to vote during French elections. So the real election that happened in France, because Senegal or the West Africa part was part of the provinces, these people they had influence. They could vote directly. Then again, they could obtain what is called Western education. They could go to the French schools. Then they were exempted from forced labor, taxation, and arbitrary arrest. By the way, France has a rule that you are guilty until proven innocent. So arbitrary arrest was very, very common, both in France and its colonies. So you could be arrested anyhow. You just go and prove your innocence in court. Now, if once you had been assimilated, you could be free from this arbitrary arrest. They enjoyed trading rights. And I'll show you that they enjoyed trading rights not only in this French province of Senegal, but across the West African French territory provinces. Then they were subjected to French judicial system. You are treated as a French, so if you go to the courts, you even have a French lawyer. They were employed in the French civil services, including army. They had the freedom of movement within the French Empire. French Empire could be even up to Madagascar, Reunion, Comoros, all these regions that French had colonized, including French itself. That is why Paris is the capital city of Africa outside Africa, because most Africans from Francophone who had been assimilated, they went and settled in Paris. Now, the reasons why assimilation policy failed in Senegal. So this assimilation, it was good, but it failed. Number 1, the policy of assimilation was expensive because these citizens, once you are French citizen, it meant that the taxes that were meant to sustain them will come from the mainstream country, that is France. So really, this overburdened the French taxpayers. Imagine Africa was a society that was being civilized, meaning the French citizens back at home had to endure the burden of even being taxed and helping these people to become educated. Number 2, to get Western medicine. Number 3, employment. So this was a burden. It became very, very expensive. Number 2, so you realize that French were willing to spend their money on Africa, unlike the British. Then there was a cultural difference. There was a cultural difference problems between Africans and Europeans. There are things that Africans love. Number 1, polygamy. So it is African to become polygamous. So you could not convince an African that having only one wife was very I was explaining the second. There was a cultural difference problem between Africans and Europeans. So I was telling you that things that Europeans love and they cannot, no, Africans love and they could not go embrace European culture because of that. Then again, African chiefs lost their authority to the French rule. Now the African chiefs, if for them, after assimilation policy was introduced, they were replaced by chiefs who were more of aligned, or chiefs who had already been assimilated into the French culture. This meant that the existing traditional, autonomic, and psychologically accepted regions were, those chiefs, they lost their positions to these chiefs. So the chiefs that were there were now puppets of the French. The lack of adequate French personnel to supervise the assimilation process. Remember, assimilation was with one, culture. Number two, way of doing things. Number three, even education. So the French personnel that was needed was a lot. When you want to turn that the French assimilation. Why? Because its application was going to lead to the loss of labor. Now, the French who had settled in Western Africa, they knew that the assimilated Africans, they were not going to be allowed to work in the French farms. Why? Because they were treated as equal citizens of France. So this meant that these Africans, the French, by the way, back at home, or those who stayed in Senegal and West Africa, they knew that automatically assimilation policy was going to make them lose African labor. Then again, the system challenged the political status quo of France, meaning French was staring at a possibility where maybe an African could even become their president. Why? Because the French who had assimilated, the Senegalese who had been assimilated, they had even voting rights. So it meant that it was challenging the status quo of the French. Again, it disregarded the Islamic aspect of African culture that made the policy to fail. One thing that the French were so Christian, especially Catholicism. So when they promoted this in Senegal, this challenged the existing Islamic culture that was predominant with the Africans. Islamic culture had allowed them even marrying up to 4 wives. It allowed them Sharia laws. And by accepting to be assimilated, it meant that you had to give up Islam and embrace Christianity. Then that became an uphill task for the Africans. Then the high standards expectation of the French for the assimilated Africans made it to be unworkable. Again, by being as French citizens, there were standards that were so unacceptable for Africans. For instance, the standard of monogamy and every other thing. It was very unworkable for Africans. Then fear that the assimilated Africans could rival the French economy. So the assimilated Africans, they were allowed to own farms also. They were allowed to conduct trade. They were allowed to move in the various French provinces of West Africa. And this meant that these French people were economically empowering the assimilated Africans. And this was just unworkable for the French because they were not going to allow the people that they colonized to rival them economically. Then the second last, the French themselves opposed it since they did not want to destroy the French colonial empire. Now, the colonial empire was meant to enable French to extract mineral riches, raw materials, and everything. Now, after assimilating the people, it meant that the French were going to make another economy again in Africa instead of deriving from Africa. This sounded an alarm to the French, who themselves, they had to oppose it, the French citizens. Why? It was destroying the French empire. Then the last thing is that the rise of African nationalism undermined the policy of assimilation. Now, African nationalism wanted nothing to do with the French. They wanted a free Africans who could govern themselves. That is where Leopold Senghor the first president of Senegal, the poet, in fact, who assumed presidency, they came in. They wanted nothing to do with French autonomy, but they wanted to become leaders. Now, this was against the French assimilation policy. Now, as I conclude, I want you to compare the British system of administration, both direct and indirect, and the French system of assimilation. Even though assimilation policy failed, the things that it achieved, even though direct and indirect policies of administration that the British applied succeeded in Africa, they had its lasting impact. Number one, the civilization mission of the French, it made Africans to become very, very educated. Again, they emerged elites or social class among the assimilated Africans. Again, the structures that were introduced during this policy of assimilation were copied by the independent government. They were inherited, which were very, very good. Then the elite class spearheaded the African nationalism in Senegal, and it led to their independence. Again, the Africans they were even allowed to take part in the affairs of the French political system. Then again, the traditional rulers, they lost the authority. But these effects cannot be compared to what the atrocities that the British left us with. They left us with ethnicity. Yes, they left us with a lot of class. So in our next, we've ended this unit. So next I'll go to paper 1, which will tackle social economic developments during colonial period in Kenya. That is paper 1. Thank you and have a nice time, ladies and gentlemen.